Exiting to Panama, the showdown over President Trump's demand for more control over the Panama Canal and his Secretary of State's first overseas mission.
She's following the economic agenda of the Trump administration for us and is recently back from a reporting trip on the Panama Canal.
Everyone is evacuating the Panama Canal right now because rumors are spreading that President Trump intends to launch a military operation to take full control of it.
China is operating the Panama Canal, and we didn't give it to China, we gave it to Panama, and we're taking it back.
Ever since his unexpected announcement that he wants to reclaim.
The Panama Canal even made its way into Trump's inauguration speech, which is supposed to set the tone for his entire presidency.
What he calls a vital trade route, panic has gripped the region. It feels like the calm before a storm that may turn into a full-scale military conflict. Historical background and ties to U.S. interests. From the moment the Panama Canal opened in 1914, it was hailed as an engineering marvel that connected two great oceans.
The Panama Canal need to think too much about the change in relations with the United States.
The Atlantic and the Pacific. Ships no longer needed to sail all the way around the treacherous tip of South America. Instead, they could cut through a narrow passage in Central America, saving days and sometimes weeks of travel time. This created huge benefits for global trade, slashing shipping costs and accelerating the movement of goods. For nearly a century, the United States maintained a strong presence in the canal zone. Originally, American engineers designed and built the canal under a treaty that granted the U.S. not only the right to construct it, but also to manage the canal and its surrounding territory. This arrangement gave Washington a powerful foothold in what many experts call the maritime crossroads of the world. Over time, this presence stirred tension among Panamanians who felt that their sovereignty was undermined by having a constant U.S. military footprint on their soil. Then came the historic Carter-Torrijos treaties in 1977, which aimed to transfer full control of the canal to Panama by the end of 1999. People across Latin America celebrated it as a victory for national self-determination, while in Washington, opinions varied. Some viewed it as a fair deal that honored Panamanian sovereignty, while others worried that losing direct oversight would endanger U.S. commercial and military interests in the region. Fast forward to the 21st century, and the canal has undergone significant expansions. The Panama Canal Authority, under Panamanian control, has modernized the waterways, boosted traffic capacity, and enabled ever larger vessels to pass. This has turned the canal into a cornerstone of global commerce, handling an estimated 6% or more of the world's seaborne trade. With such a high volume of goods, including oil, grain, cars, and electronics, traveling through its locks, any crisis in the canal has ripple effects across every continent. Trump's path back to power and sudden announcement. Trump's second inauguration in January 2025 was surrounded by controversy from the start. He had campaigned on themes of economic revitalization, tougher immigration policies, and reclaiming what he called lost American assets.
What is behind President-elect Donald Trump's seeming obsession with the Panama Canal? He's threatened in recent weeks to take back the canal, once controlled by the United States.
Political commentators debated whether such rhetoric was just a figure of speech or an actual foreshadowing of possible aggressive actions abroad. During his inaugural address, few expected him to declare the intention to seize the Panama Canal. But that is exactly what happened. Standing at the podium, Trump pointed his finger, laid out the importance of controlling key trade routes, and said the canal was essential for U.S. security and prosperity. He insisted that America's economic future depended on preventing rivals, especially China, from expanding their reach at the canal's gates. Many supporters cheered this bold promise, seeing it as proof that Trump would restore American dominance in global shipping lanes. "This is the leadership we've been missing," some exclaimed. They felt the canal had been handed over too freely in the late 20th century, and that the US was paying the price by losing ground to other powers. Social media lit up with hashtags hailing the move as a triumphant return to strong US policy. Yet, others stood aghast. Political opponents accused Trump of brazen imperialism, claiming his announcement would provoke an immediate international backlash. Democratic lawmakers called it reckless warmongering, and the newly minted Senate minority vowed to block any funding for military ops in Central America. Meanwhile, even some Republicans felt uneasy, reminding Trump that forcibly taking the canal would not only break international laws, but also strain alliances across Latin America and beyond. Evacuations and regional panic. Once President Trump's intent became clear, there was a scramble among foreign nationals living or working in Panama. Embassies immediately circulated advisories telling their citizens to consider leaving the country if they didn't have essential duties to stay. Flights out of Panama City's main airport started to fill up. Airlines reported frantic calls from families trying to book last-minute tickets. It wasn't just Americans who were apprehensive. Europeans, Asians, and Latin Americans all felt the tension. Inside Panama City, expatriate communities that once led peaceful lives near beaches or in upscale neighborhoods suddenly found themselves contemplating evacuation plans. Local supermarkets and corner stores experienced runs on supplies as rumors spread about possible shortages. People feared that if tensions escalated into a shooting conflict, the canal and its surrounding infrastructure might become a focal point for military engagements. Panamanians themselves faced a tough dilemma. Should they stay in their homes or try to move to safer areas away from major ports and the canal? Many older residents remembered past strife, such as the 1989 US invasion to remove General Noriega, and worried that once again, violence might erupt. Younger generations, who had grown up in a more globally connected Panama, struggled to grasp that their country could become ground zero for a massive power struggle. Small businesses in the canal zone began shuttering. Families that depended on tourism or canal-related trade saw their incomes dry up almost overnight. Fishermen in coastal towns worried about naval blockades or restricted waters. Truck drivers, accustomed to hauling cargo from ships crossing the isthmus, were told that there might be new security checkpoints or curfews. Faced with this chaos, local communities started to organize small relief efforts, distributing food and medical supplies to the vulnerable. Latin America's response and calls for unity. Throughout the region, leaders in Latin America watched the situation unfold with anger and anxiety. History is heavy in this part of the world, where memories of foreign interventions by larger powers remain vivid. The idea of the US once again sending troops to override a sovereign nation struck a raw nerve. Many countries reacted by issuing statements condemning what they viewed as a threat to Panamanian autonomy. In an emergency summit held in Mexico City, representatives from various Latin American governments gathered to discuss a unified response. Diplomatic envoys from Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Peru, and others sought to coordinate an approach that would discourage any armed incursion. They argued that allowing the takeover of the canal would set a dangerous precedent, effectively inviting other powerful nations to meddle in Latin America's affairs. Declarations condemning the move came swiftly. Colombia, sharing a land border with Panama, announced it would not permit crossing of foreign troops or war machinery through its territory. Brazil's president took to social media, calling for calm, but making it clear that any violation of Panamanian sovereignty would be seen as an attack on the broader principle of non-intervention in Latin America. Even countries that usually remained neutral in such matters felt compelled to speak out, fearing that the canal issue could escalate into a continental crisis. At the same time, some leaders walked a diplomatic tightrope, urging a peaceful resolution. They recognized that the United States has enormous economic influence in the region, with extensive trade links, corporate investments, and security collaborations. As a result, countries that heavily rely on U.S. trade shipments tried not to alienate Washington entirely. This delicate balance gave rise to carefully worded communiques, stating disapproval of any aggression, but also encouraging dialogue to find a swift resolution. On the streets of Latin American capitals, protests in solidarity with Panama took shape. Crowds gathered in front of U.S. embassies, holding posters proclaiming "Hands off Panama" or "No more imperialism." College students and activists led chants, connecting the canal crisis to broader themes of independence from foreign meddling. In some places, demonstrations turned violent when frustrated citizens clashed with local police, sensing that their governments might soften under U.S. pressure. Military posturing and naval maneuvers. As political tensions soared, the U.S. military began a series of moves that left little doubt about its readiness to engage if ordered. Warships, including destroyers and frigates, were spotted moving closer to the waters near Central America. Satellite images circulated on news networks, showing an armada forming in strategic positions that would permit rapid deployment. The Pentagon neither confirmed nor denied the exact scope of the operation, but officials stressed that the U.S. was prepared to protect American interests and citizens. The buildup struck an unsettling tone in Panama. Their small defense forces, not well equipped to counter a superpower, scrambled to bolster what little defense they had. Checkpoints sprang up around crucial junctions near the canal. Panamanian soldiers stood guard with a mixture of determination and anxiety, aware of the vast difference in size and technology between them and the U.S. military. Government spokespeople pleaded for calm, insisting that diplomacy still had a chance. Naval skirmishes became a real possibility when rumors surfaced that Chinese vessels might sail into the region to secure Beijing's investments in Panamanian ports. Although China formally denied any intention to deploy warships to the canal zone, the mere speculation roused excitement and apprehension. Experts cautioned that the presence of two major naval powers in such a narrow maritime corridor would dangerously raise the risk of miscalculation or accidental confrontations. Back in Washington, generals and national security advisors held closed-door meetings to weigh the risks. Taking over the Panama Canal may seem straightforward in theory, but in practice, it is a massive undertaking. The canal zone covers a vast area of waterways, locks, control towers, docks, and vital land routes. Even with superior firepower, an occupying force would need thousands of boots on the ground to hold key assets and maintain security. Guerrilla attacks by Panamanian resistance groups could sharply complicate any occupation. Economic shockwaves and market turmoil. While the looming specter of battle grabbed headlines, the financial impact was immediate and far-reaching. Any disturbance to the Panama Canal poses a massive threat to global trade, as about 6% of the world's maritime commerce flows through its locks. As U.S. naval vessels loomed in the region, insurance rates for ships traveling through the canal skyrocketed. Shipping companies rerouted vessels to avoid potential flashpoints, though the alternative detour around South America added weeks to travel time and considerably increased fuel costs. Global markets reacted predictably. Major stock indices fell amid investor nervousness. Companies reliant on imports and exports through the canal revised their profit forecasts downward. A sense of instability permeated boardrooms from New York to Tokyo. Some investors liquidated positions, fearing that an actual shooting conflict would freeze canal operations entirely. Currency markets also wobbled, with the US dollar surging in a flight to safety, yet paradoxically creating concerns about rising costs in emerging markets. American farmers, many of whom shipped grain and beef through the canal, found themselves trapped in a logistical nightmare. Their clients in Asia and Europe faced delays and elevated costs from shipping disruptions. Normally, these farm exports benefit from fast transit times. Now, bobbing cargo ships waited in lines at overshadowed ports, searching for any safe route. The confusion led to rotting perishables in some cases, compounding losses for producers who could hardly afford it. In the energy sector, oil and gas prices spiked as traders grew anxious over the possibility of lengthy canal closures. Though pipelines and other shipping methods exist, the canal remains a major corridor for certain petroleum products. As a result, everyday consumers saw higher prices at the pump. Freight costs soared, raising the cost of consumer goods. Everything from electronics to fresh fruit was affected. Inflation threatened to accelerate in countries that were part of extended global supply chains. Multinational corporations, particularly those in the tech industry, began to press the administration to cool its stance. CEOs flew to Washington, privately warning policymakers that a prolonged standoff could trigger a significant economic slowdown. Even industries not directly shipping through the canal worried about second-order repercussions, such as shipping container shortages, higher insurance premiums, and reduced consumer confidence. These supply chain disruptions had the potential to tip the global economy into a downturn if no resolution appeared soon. Media frenzy and public opinion. As always in the modern era, the Panama Canal crisis morphed into a media phenomenon. 24-hour news channels bombarded viewers with dramatic footage of ships stuck in limbo, heavily armed US soldiers in camouflage gear landing at local airstrips, and throngs of desperate families trying to cross out of Panama. Talk show hosts invited experts, strategists, and even conspiracy theorists to argue about every possible scenario, fueling a sense of chaos. Within the United States, the public was sharply divided. Some staunch Trump supporters believed this was patriotic, taking back what they considered rightfully American. They shared social media posts praising the bold move to ensure the country's place as a global superpower. Others were horrified, comparing the takeover to past colonial adventures they believed should remain in the history books. They called for legislative action to hold the administration in check, and marches sprang up in major cities denouncing the potential for war. Opinion polls showed a near 50-50 split, highlighting that many Americans were not fully aware of the canal's complexities. Some thought controlling it would guarantee national security advantages and provide leverage over global rivals. Critics, however, insisted that it would further erode America's international standing, stoking anti-US sentiment around the globe. Within days, protest gatherings in New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, and Seattle drew massive crowds carrying signs like "No War for a Waterway" and "Stop Colonial Ambitions." International media outlets portrayed the crisis through their own lenses. European channels tended to criticize the US push, linking it to a broader pattern of aggressive foreign interventions. Chinese state media accused Washington of hypocrisy, pointing out that the US invoked international law only when convenient. Latin American media was understandably the most emotional, highlighting scenes of displacement and drawing parallels to a long history of foreign control in the region. Humanitarian concerns and scenes of displacement. While politicians and experts sparred, ordinary people in Panama faced a growing humanitarian test. As the US military buildup continued, some normal services faltered. Local authorities had to focus on the security situation, leaving fewer resources for civil tasks. Hospitals, especially in regions near the canal, worried they might soon be overwhelmed if fighting broke out. Pharmacies saw shortages in essential medicines as panic buying and disrupted supply lines took a toll. Roads leading from the canal zone to the interior became clogged with vehicles carrying families heading to safer areas. Small towns along these routes reported a huge influx of people seeking temporary shelter. Hotels and guest houses quickly filled up, and many churches or community centers turned into improvised dormitories. Children, confused and frightened, asked why they had to leave their homes. Parents tried to remain calm, but their eyes betrayed fear of what might come next. International aid organizations arrived to assess conditions, though some found their tasks complicated by unstable logistics. The presence of foreign media teams crafted scenes reminiscent of war zones in other parts of the world. Long lines of citizens holding suitcases, baby strollers, and plastic bags, waiting for buses funded by relief groups. Volunteers distributed food, blankets, and clean water. Even local shops pitched in, offering discounted goods or freebies to those in urgent need. The Panamanian government tried to maintain order, but as days passed without a de-escalation, tensions between local police and nervous evacuated citizens sometimes flared. Rumors circulated of pockets of resistance forming to prepare for a U.S. invasion. Though no large-scale fighting had yet erupted, scattered reports suggested that small sabotage groups were preparing to disrupt U.S. troop movements should they advance deeper into the canal zone. This potential for armed conflict drew the concern of multiple human rights organizations. They warned that if combat broke out, vulnerable populations, like children, the elderly, and those with disabilities, could be caught in the crossfire. They also cautioned about the fate of workers, including many migrants from elsewhere in Latin America, who relied on canal-related industries for their livelihoods. With shipping halted or diverted, joblessness spiked, adding another layer of despair. Evacuations rippled outward. Wealthier Panamanians flew to Miami, Madrid, or Mexico City, while those who lacked passports or financial means had fewer options. Some tried to cross into neighboring countries on foot. The spectacle of anxious families forming caravans in the hope of finding refuge elsewhere showed how quickly a once stable environment can fall into a humanitarian crisis. Meanwhile, relief agencies pleaded for a diplomatic solution that could prevent actual fighting and more widespread displacement. Diplomatic overtures and stalled talks. Behind closed doors, frantic diplomatic efforts were underway. Latin American leaders offered to mediate. European Union officials weighed in, proposing an international observation mission to ensure the canal's neutrality. The United Nations Security Council held exclusive sessions where ambassadors from across the world jousted with words, attempting to forestall a full-blown conflict. China's representative demanded that the U.S. respect Panamanian sovereignty and threatened consequences if hostilities escalated. Washington insisted on direct negotiations with Panama, but these talks quickly stalled. Panamanian negotiators, supported by a wave of regional backing, insisted that the U.S. had no legitimate reason to override the Carter-Torrijos treaties. They also accused Trump of humiliating their nation on the global stage by disregarding them as mere caretakers of what rightfully belonged to them. In response, U.S. officials argued they needed firm guarantees that China would not use the canal to threaten U.S. naval routes. Proposals that might have halted the crisis, such as a new treaty that would give the U.S. a say in canal operations without fully annexing it, faced hostility on both sides. Panama's leadership saw such deals as surrender under duress. Many Panamanians felt they had successfully managed the canal for decades, turning it into a more modern maritime highway without external interference. They questioned why, after all these years, the US would suddenly claim their efforts were insufficient. The Trump administration, for its part, signaled that partial measures might be considered if Panama and China agreed to scale back their cooperation in the Canal Zone. Washington demanded robust oversight over toll rates, security protocols, and any future infrastructure deals. This effectively served as an ultimatum. Either Panama froze out China's deeper involvement, or the US would take matters into its own hands to secure the canal for US strategic purposes. In response, Beijing quietly distanced itself from direct negotiations, not wishing to appear subordinate to any concessions. Still, Chinese diplomats maintained frequent contact with their Panamanian counterparts, discussing trade and aid packages that could help sustain Panama through the crisis. This setup alarmed Washington, which saw it as confirmation that the canal could become a lever for another superpower. Tensions soared, with each day passing without a breakthrough. Possible outcomes and the uncertain road ahead. With the crisis now front and center on the global stage, experts paint a range of possible scenarios. One scenario suggests that Trump might escalate further, authorizing a limited strike or blockade to force Panama into concessions. This would risk open combat, given the strong rhetoric from Panamanian officials and resistance groups that have formed throughout the country. The humanitarian toll could be catastrophic, and global trade would be even more deeply disrupted. Another outcome envisions Trump backing down, perhaps due to domestic pressure from businesses suffering immense losses. If the economic fallout becomes too great and protests at home grow louder, the administration could pivot. They might spin a narrative that the mission was accomplished by bringing attention to the canal's strategic importance, then quietly withdraw troops to avoid a protracted conflict. In that case, the crisis would likely leave a deep mark on US-Latin America relations for years to come. Some speculate about a brokered settlement involving multinational oversight. Under such an arrangement, multiple countries, including the US and China, could form a neutral body to supervise the canal. This might ensure it remains open to all ships under internationally recognized guidelines, preventing any single nation from dominating. Though appealing to many outside observers, this solution might run into nationalist objections on all sides, as it dilutes the power of both Panama and the US over a historically contested waterway. Should diplomacy completely fail, the worst-case scenario is a broader regional conflict. Other nations in Latin America, outraged by a US takeover, might cut ties with Washington or impose sanctions of their own. China, for its part, could retaliate with economic measures, restricting US access to raw materials and markets, thus triggering a global trade war. If fighting spreads, we could witness a humanitarian crisis that extends well beyond Panama's borders, affecting migration flows and destabilizing Central America as a whole. Furthermore, the environmental toll of a prolonged military occupation is not trivial. The canal's watershed areas are delicate ecosystems crucial for its operation. Bombing or sabotage could damage the locks, cause pollution in the waterway, and disrupt the canal's water supply. That, in turn, might leave a permanent scar on global shipping routes, hammering supply chains far into the future.